Everybody, it's great to be here. My name is Brandon Vamos, and I'm the cellist of the Pacifica Quartet, and I teach at Jacobs School of Music at Indiana University. Very happy to have to be able to do another cello chat and to have a discussion. I look forward to your questions. I'm also really happy about possibly doing some more live performances. It's been a long time, and we've just started to do a couple of smaller performances for smaller audiences. It's been great. Really optimistic about returning to some normalcy in terms of traveling a little bit and performing and teaching and seeing people. So it's really exciting right now. But I thought I know it takes a little time for questions to come in, so I thought maybe I would chat a little bit about some things I've been thinking about, and mainly about vibrato. That's sort of been on my mind a lot recently, and I've been experimenting with different kinds of vibrato and thinking about tools that help me achieve the vibratos that I'm looking for, that sort of affect my sound, my tone and color and mood and all of those things. And I was actually having a discussion with my mother the other day, and my mother is she's at a later stage in her life, and we were discussing it, and she says, well, I'm not happy with my vibrato, so I'm changing my vibrato. And I was kind of surprised. I've always liked her vibrato, and she says, no, I'm completely changing it now. And it's kind of inspiring that she was doing this, and she played for me, and it was like very different. She thought her vibrato was too slow, and she wanted to have more variety. So she was still thinking about how she could still work on her sound, her vibrato, and how it could enhance her playing. And I thought that was very impressive. And so I've been kind of doing the same as well, thinking about the tools that I use in my vibrato that help me achieve my musical ideas. And so, and some of those tools, and I'd love to hear your feedback if you have thoughts, other ideas. But some of the things I've been thinking about are, and these are things that, of course, we all think about, but even in more detail, is where I place my finger placement, and how much flesh, how much fingertip I'm using. And of course, we all think about, you want a fleshier, deeper sound, you flatten your finger. But there's so much area in there that you can use in such variety. So I've been thinking that's, as a tool, something to shape my vibrato a little bit. And I've been thinking about the angle of the hand. So this is one of the ideas that I've been playing around with, that, and I think the angle has probably given me the most variety in my vibrato. And this is something that I got from my teachers. I know Paul Katz, immediately we talked about in my lessons, was an angle of the hand, not only for moving up and down the instrument. I mean, I'm talking about a slight angle, but also for vibrato. My teacher, Aldo Parisot, we worked on, he gave me these exercises, and I don't think I knew what they were for at the time. I just did them, and I sounded better, and I liked it. I didn't really think about what it was, but it had to do with what the other fingers are doing when you're playing. For example, in fourth position, if you're playing a second finger, he would ask me to bring my first finger over the G string. Third finger, second finger over the G string, first finger over the C string, fourth finger again. So transferring the fingers over here. Of course, what that does is it changes the angle of your hand, but it also changes the amount of finger that's meeting the string. So the more finger that's meeting, the more varied depth of vibrato I think you get. If you're more square, I think it's more of a fingertip vibrato. And this increases the amount of finger that's contacting. Also, possibly the amount of weight. And that's another thing that I think is important to think about in vibrato, is how much weight you have changes it. If you want a lot of depth, you can drop it if it's something slow and deep. Or less weight for maybe a connecting vibrato, where you're more on top of the string. So that's another aspect. But this changing the angle of the hand for me is something that always makes a difference. And when I think about that, I can find a different shade of vibrato, a different speed of vibrato, maybe a different width even. So that's been very, very helpful. Of course, I think the vibrato is a complement to your right hand. And a lot of people say, well, the bow is 90% of how you produce your sound and your phrasing and shaping. And I agree with that. But I think that 10% is gigantic. How you complement the bow speed and the bow pressure in the vibrato can really add that special dimension. But it has to relate to the bow. So I've been practicing a lot, and with my students as well, without vibrato, because I think that's another skill. I think it adds, if you can focus on this clearly, and then you tailor the vibrato to the bow, it's a better way of thinking about it. So, for example, you do the second theme of Dvorak, I've been experimenting, is thinking about how I use my bow speed to shape the phrase. And pressure and things like that. And then adding the vibrato depending on the mood that I want. Is it something very sweet? Is it something incredibly tender and loving? Or is it a little bit more emotional, a little bit more with emotion? So you can vary that, and that relates to the bow. So if it's or if you want something more intense, maybe the speed is faster. Maybe I change my angle. Here is where I might think about the angle of my hand, the pad of the finger a little bit more. That's one example of sort of complementing the vibrato to the bow. And then a lot of my vibrato practice, I think, if you focus on repertoire, of course there are a lot of great vibrato exercises. You can focus on rhythmic vibrato, with metronome and eighth notes and triplets and sixteenths to develop sort of an evenness and a control in your vibrato. That's a good thing to do. I know that a lot of the big soloists work on opening their vibrato to create a lot of amplitude. And if you're playing a big concerto in a gigantic hall, if your vibrato doesn't have the waves, the sound doesn't travel. So thinking about being able to have a loose, open vibrato, maybe even exaggerating that so that you do like up and down the instrument. So that's another tool. But for me recently, I prefer doing it in the repertoire so that you're getting the sense of the musical line, how the vibrato can shape a phrase, how it can go from one note to the next. It's constantly changing. And again, how it relates to the bow and how it relates to the emotional content of anything you're playing. Schumann Concerto, that beginning I find is so difficult because it's so emotional. It's piano, espressivo, there's an intensity, but it's not mezzo forte. Oftentimes, with the opening that it sort of coming out of this mist, very sort of almost depressed quality of sound, you often hear this vibrato, very full-throated vibrato that I don't think quite captures that mood. Again, this is all personal, but in my my thinking these days. How do I come out of that? How do I find what I want? So again, I think that has to do with how much vibrato, my finger placement, the kind of use of bow that I'm getting. And I mean, there's so many examples in the repertoire. Then you have, like at the end of that first page, up on high on the A string where you want something incredibly intense. What I've been thinking about there is, especially in this range, that, and I hate to say it, but you almost can't be too relaxed. You have to have some, maybe it's not tension, intensity, or firmness in the body. A lot of it has to do with the balance where you are. Maybe you need a little bit more muscles from the back, but also this connection from the elbow, this firm connection here where you're able to develop that speed and intensity. So if your arm is not in the right place, or if it's too flimsy, you can't quite capture that intensity. So I've been thinking about that a lot, and that's certainly increases the range of intensity and speed and excitement in the sound. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts about vibrato, and so if anybody has questions about anything, that's great. But if you have some thoughts on vibrato or some other ideas about tools that are helpful, I would love to hear those. Oh, one other thought is what the other fingers are doing with the vibrato. This is another great tool. So a wider, more open vibrato. Maybe the fingers are a little more spread. It's a lot like the figure skater analogy, when they want to do a very wide rotation turn, their body's more open and the spin is slower. And then when they want to get that speed, they curl up and they get the really intense speed. And I think that's the same in the hand. So if you have something like this and you want to open the hand, you develop the vibrato. If you're going for something with a quiet intensity, that shimmering sound, maybe the hand is a little more coiled in that regard. Okay, I have some questions from Jonathan Dalbert. Do you have any exercise to get control of your vibrato? I've understood the foundations, but my arm has a tendency to vibrate faster than I intend. Yeah, I was mentioning before about rhythmic vibrato exercises. I find if there's a very tight vibrato that sort of starts and stops, one of the best exercises is just to really gain rhythmic control of your vibrato. I don't know if I should. So putting the metronome on and just working on eighth notes, just to getting the ease. I think when the vibrato gets tight as well, either the vibrato is mostly focused in the hand and the fingers, or mostly in the forearm area, and that something is locked back here. So I think that would be the first step, is to make sure that there's freedom from your bigger muscles. I've never really understood, of course, violinists talk about hand vibrato, wrist vibrato, arm vibrato. For cellists, it's always been arm vibrato, but I know there are different thoughts on that. And maybe I do use at times, I haven't thought enough about it, but I think the idea of having freedom in this part from the back is really important. So if the vibrato is tight, usually I investigate that aspect. Richard Aaron has a great exercise where you take a tennis ball and you roll over it. And I think what that does is it gets the whole arm back involved in the vibrato, that rotating. But in terms of control, I think this exercise of triplets, 16 notes. even controlled vibrato. Now that's, we're not messing around. I guess in a way we are messing around with speed because it's slower and faster. But the goal is to have a vibrato that's not starting and stopping, really. But that's a very good question. This is a question from Suzanne Angela Dicker. I would love to know how Mr. Vamos helps students with satie. Okay, well, I was teaching somebody this morning Rococo Variations, the last variation, and I think it depends on what the repertoire is and what kind of satie you're looking for. But this one in particular, we were working on is the vertical aspect of the up and down motion. For me, that's how I feel it. I feel like satie is a stroke where the string is the bow's hair is basically on the string, but it's you're engaging the bounce of the stick. And I think this vertical motion for me is the best way to get it. If you're in the right part of the bow and you have that motion, and I think the best way to get that is by this rhythm. So you can feel the bounce right from here. So we were working on that this morning and it was really, really helping. Of course, you have to find the right part of the bow for that stroke. I think any rhythmic exercise is a good way of developing that. But people have different ideas of how much verticality it is, or if it's side to side even. But I really think that up and down motion from the wrist is how you find that satie. This is a question from Christine Salder. How does one practice in order to attain a wider vibrato? Any tips? Yeah, I mean, I was showing an exercise that I've been doing pretty much every day to develop a wider vibrato. And it's just, I do it in my scales and I just find the widest oscillation that I can. And a lot of it is using your ear. You know, if you hear the oscillation, then it's there. And I think that's a lot of vibrato really, and sound in general, comes from the connection of the ear to what you're doing. And if you use that as a guide, I think anybody can develop any kind of vibrato they want to. When you start to look at your hand and think, I think that's where things get difficult. So for me, when I want a wide vibrato, if I close my eyes or I look up and I listen to the sound, it's my ear can sort of tell my arm what it needs to do. If it's too tight, then you can't get the wide vibrato. If you're pressing too much, it's hard to get that wide vibrato. So I think sometimes I think about how much weight I want in my finger. I mean, sometimes I want more weight. Sometimes I want less weight, almost like you're a butterfly on the string. You're landing on the string, not so much into the fingerboard, and that will help. But and making sure that I have freedom back here. That when I vibrate, I feel freedom, and I feel those back muscles, shoulder blades moving a little bit, not as much as maybe over here. But I would try practicing scales. Just take a scale and do slow, really slow, wobbly vibrato. It doesn't sound great, but it's loosening the joints. It's loosening the arm and the hand. You're finding that balance. And maybe a wider vibrato needs a different contact point. Perhaps you need a little bit more flesh than you would. And maybe it's hard to get a really wide vibrato on the fingertips. So by playing with the pad and where you are, even this joint a little bit, having flexibility here, you can find where you need to be. So this is important. I haven't really mentioned that, but this joint needs to have some ability to either be this way or this way. And that's what changes a lot of that contact point. So angle of hand, maybe a little more angle. I'm not crazy about my fourth finger these days, so I might sit on it for a second. And another thing I didn't mention about vibrato is the different vibratos on the different strings. I think a C string vibrato is different than an A string vibrato. Of course, it depends on the emotion, the mood, and the repertoire, but I think the thicker C string needs a wider vibrato in general. For example, you're playing Prokofiev sonata. If you do, sounds pretty good on the A string. Doesn't sound great there. So taking me a second to find the vibrato I want, and I think that's okay too when you're trying to develop a wider vibrato. Is be patient, make changes. If you don't change anything, your vibrato's not going to change. But if I fool around with it for a second, I might find something new. Maybe not new, but more in line with what I want. But yeah, I think I like to start with the wide, wobbly vibrato in the morning, and that gets me limbered as an exercise. Great question, thank you. Question from Gerald Daler. What advice can you give to young quartets in terms of rehearsal efficiency and make decisions on musical ideas? Now, that's always a good idea. I mean, a great question, because from experience, when our quartet started rehearsing over 25 years ago, we did a lot of rehearsing. We were crazy. We rehearsed 7 hours, 8 hours a day, sometimes 9 to 5, with a little lunch break. And we wanted to be good. We were diligent. We were going to work hard, and this was our decision. But did we need those hours? No. Did we waste a lot of time? Yes. Could we have done it better? Could we have even achieved more in a much smaller amount of time? For sure. So many things that can create lack of efficiency for young quartets. Less practice, too much rehearsal is one. Preparation can save so much time in a rehearsal. So if everybody comes to that rehearsal, it's a new piece, let's say, but everybody has worked on their part. They've thought about the score. They've looked at the score. They think about tempo. They think about mood and character. They think about intonation. For a cellist, when they come to that rehearsal, for everybody, but if the cellist is basically not centered in pitch, there's chances are the quartet's going to be really out of tune. That's going to cause a huge amount of time focused on rehearsing intonation. So before my rehearsals, I make sure that I go through a movement for intonation, every note, with or without vibrato, just focused on centering pitch, overtones, making sure that I think about just intonation, expressive intonation, what I'm doing with my intonation, how centered am I? And if I do that, I feel like we spend way less time rehearsing intonation. Of course, you have to rehearse intonation. There's always things to figure out. But if there's individual intonation, then you're adding way more time. That's going to be a lot of extra work. Now, musical decisions are tricky because in a quartet, you want everybody to feel like they have a say in what's going on. And you want to find an interpretation amongst the four of you that is committed, that's not compromised in any way, but really, and that takes time, and that takes being open to ideas that are not yours, because oftentimes those ideas you find are better than your original idea, or maybe this idea and this idea make an idea that's way better, or maybe you're saying the same things. But I think what I find that is where groups lack efficiency is when they get stuck on something, a musical problem, and they sit on it and they spend 25 minutes discussing it, and they're going in circles, and there's resistance and there's defensiveness, as opposed to trying a few ideas, playing it one way, playing it the other, leaving it, coming back to it. Of course, right before performance, you have to be committed to one idea or the other, but things change, and all of a sudden, this person who had this idea is doing this idea, and maybe they're doing that idea. So it's a matter of flexibility and being open, and ideas change. You know, we play a piece over and over, and if it was static, it would be very boring, not just for us as musicians, but even for the audience, because you sit with an idea too long, and you do it the same way, and it starts to become, you start to be doing it by rote. Just, it happens. And by constantly exploring all the time, that's what I think keeps the performer more interested, and then the audience will pick up on that. But that's a great question. I think it's important to not get stuck in a quartet rehearsal where you do too much intonation, where you're not moving along. Thinking a big picture, maybe it depends on the stage of where you are in that piece. We like to get a big overview in the beginning, so we sit down, we think about tempo, we think about structure, where the themes are, the characters of the themes, bigger ideas, bigger phrases, and then as we get pickier, we start to focus on the articulations. This is not the first rehearsal, though. Might even be the third rehearsal. Then we start to think about matching vibratos and where we are in the bow, and little intonation, little ensemble things where we need to, who's leading what, and it gets narrower. And then as we're getting closer to that performance, then we start big picture again. And that, I think that's the best way to be efficient, to learn things quickly, to not get stuck, and probably not make you rehearse 10 hours a day if you can think more along those lines. So I hope that sort of answers. That's how we feel about, at least how I feel about being efficient in a quartet rehearsal. Question from our YouTube audience. Hello, how do you do fast cantabile vibrato? It is hard for me to maintain fast vibrato without strain. Yeah, so something that's singing that's fast. I guess maybe like in the Dvorak well, maybe that's not too fast. Well, some of the things that I've mentioned already, I think if you can think about, well, how much weight do you need? Maybe if you're feeling strained, you are not finding enough weight. And this is something that I think about. Sometimes I want, if it's slow, cantabile, I want to feel a little bit more weight. And in a way that relaxes me, I don't feel like I'm holding up too much. That's one way of, I think, releasing the strain. So how much weight or how much lift do you want in your vibrato? But if you're feeling too much strain, you've got to think about where you're vibrating to. It's very possible that the vibrato, and I don't know, obviously the person asking the question, but it's very possible that you're focused too much, the vibrato's coming too much from the finger or only from here, and that you don't have a connection to the elbow. There's a balance here, and even a freedom in the upper arm. So if you can kind of analyze what's going on, even from your back, maybe even from your feet, what's causing those issues. But that's a very good question, and it's definitely worth exploring, being aware of your physicality, and again, how to make a change. Yeah. Question from Irene Palacios Pao. What are the fingers of weight and support in the right hand on the arch? What is your recommendation? What are the fingers of weight and support in the right hand on the arch? Well, I think part of that question, which I find interesting, is the idea of arch, which I don't think is often talked about. And we often talk about support by arm weight, which of course is very important. But if you say play with arm weight, I mean, that's playing with arm weight, but that's not how you would play. You don't play like that, But thinking about arch, I mean, I think that's how we get our support in the hand. And it has to do, it's just a lot like a bridge. When you go over a bridge, you never see a flat bridge. I mean, there would be no support here. They're always curved. That's what gives its strength. You have a pillar, the arching, and that's where you have your strength. And I think that it's the same in the bow, in the right arm, is that here's a pillar, here is my arch. And so by having that arch, I have the support. And then you don't have to create too much tension in the bow hand. You can be very flexible and find depth of sound, but it really has to do with this. Now that's with arch, that's how you find arm weight and relaxation. Without arch, it's mostly here, pressure and squeezing. Now I can feel relax in my hand. I can feel that flexibility in the joints. And I have that, hopefully that depth of sound where I feel like I'm going through the cello a little bit more. If I don't have that arch, I lose it in support in the fingers. I hope that answers the question that you were asking. But if not, it's something that I feel strongly about. This is Inez Miranda asks, hello, Mr. Ramos, how do you approach vibrato on the higher positions on the cello? So, yeah, I have been thinking a lot about that recently. And I think a lot of it has to do with balance up here, finding a vibrato. If I'm not balanced, if my weight is back here and not on the note I'm playing, I lose focus in my sound. It creates a little bit of tension. See that a lot, broken arm positions. But it also has to do with, I've been thinking a lot about movement in the entire body and how that affects sound, both in the right and the left arm, and about the muscles that go around your spine all the ways up your back into your shoulder blades and how they relate and so if I'm in a higher position, I feel like I have to make some adjustments to get the kind of vibrato and sound that I want, both in the right and the left hand. So I think a lot about this kind of motion, that I'm moving from the hips, bringing my arm around. And it's very slight, but there's constantly a motion. We were working on something in a lesson earlier today, just getting from here to here, in just that little, or coming around lower strings, feeling that motion. But if I'm trying to get, working on my vibrato, like in that. So I want to find that balance on that finger. I might even turn my cello with my knee, lift it up a little bit, bring my body around. Now I can feel this, and I feel that my weight is centered right here. And then I have the ability to find the sound that I want. And it can be a wide sound too, you can... But definitely the freedom in the body from the hips is very important in the kind of vibrato that you ultimately get. And if you're very rigid here, you're not playing around with where you are here, both for your left and right side. I think you're gonna lose a lot. That freedom from back here is really liberating, and I can hear it in the sound if I think about it. That's a great question. Thank you. Oh, that's a very good question. Question from Jane Cruz. How do you provide a better foundation to your chamber ensemble sound as the cellist? I have always struggled with balance, when to play more and less. Any advice? Wow, yes, and this is always very tricky. And sometimes you don't know if you're playing too loud or not until you get in the hall. But I feel like I've definitely improved over time, and I'm still improving and being aware of how much I need to give and when I need to take a back seat, and how to have a present sound, a sound that's engaging and involved in what's going on around me that doesn't cover. But when I need to be more in the string, to give more presence from the bottom of the group, that like all the quartets that I've always admired have a deep resonant bass sound. I think about my teachers, the Cleveland Quartet, going to those concerts, and Paul Katz has this such bass support. It's so ringing and resonant, and the quartet sounds so much better because they have something to sink into. It affects the intonation and blend. So, and I love my cello. I think it really helps in that regard for the C string, the depth I have here. But it's when to know how much to give. If there's a solo above you and you have a single note, and it's a higher range, you often have to really, really back off, and oftentimes not play the dynamic that's written. Play it convincingly, but knowing how to get out of somebody's way. And for me, a lot of balance has to do with listening. If I'm really focused on, I'm aware, I've got my antennas out, and I'm listening to the whole group and how people are shaping whoever has the line. And if I'm really hearing that way, I don't think I get in the way. I think I'm able to let people make sure that the textures that need to be heard are being heard. And it comes from the listening. But then also to know when I need to play deeper, and when the quartet needs more support. Chorale figures, I feel like I need to be a little more deeper in the string. Certain bass lines where the harmony is so important in the bass line, then I know that I have to sort of give a little bit more. And it all has to do with kind of weight and contact point and sort of depth of sound. But we talk about balance in our quartet all the time. And we want the listener to know exactly, be able to grab on to what they need to grab onto, to hear clarity in the quartet, but always have a clarity about what is the main voice, what is the secondary voice. And a lot of that has to do with doing it in rehearsal. And again, with preparation, if you, as a quartet player, you look at the score, you listen to it, you understand what the balance should be. And it's not always an obvious thing. Sometimes it's something that has to be hashed out in rehearsal and decided upon. But having a basic idea before that first rehearsal of what the proper voicing is in balance makes things a lot easier. I know I haven't done it in a while, but I used to color the score in with where I thought that line was going. It adds such a clarity when a quartet knows what the balance should be. And in a way, it fixes things like ensemble and intonation, strangely enough, because you're listening for, everybody's sort of listening for the same voice. They hear the line over here, this is an underneath line, and they hear it pass to here. So when you're all sort of keyed into the same thing, it solves a lot of those ensemble problems that are created by a lack of awareness of, where the line is and where it should be. But that's a terrific question. I hope I helped in a small way. Question from Benjamin Schultz. In what way does playing professionally in a professional orchestra affect the way you play and practice individually? Well, I haven't played in a professional orchestra in a long time. Or really much in my life at all, being a string quartet player. But for me, orchestra playing is playing chamber music. And a good orchestra player is a good chamber musician, somebody that listens to his section, can fit into a section, can be flexible within that section and blend in a section. Somebody who listens well to what's going on around them and is so sensitively aware that they are sort of in this realm out here where they're watching a conductor, they're watching the principal player, or they are the principal player, they're connecting with the other instruments. And I think that's what makes a really great orchestral player. What makes a good chamber musician, makes a good anything, a good teacher, I think, the better that you listen, the better you comprehend what's going on and you can interact with others, I think it's a process that's constantly evolving. I feel like over the years I'm getting better at listening, and it's still we come back to certain pieces and I feel like my ears are not sharp enough and I'm not as aware as I can be, and I have to concentrate even more, get more familiar with my part so that I can do that. But I think playing in an orchestra is great training because it teaches you how to be disciplined in that way and how not to just go off in your own tangent, but be aware of what's going on. And I think it's a great training process. And I think all of the aspects of playing music, chamber music, orchestral playing, solo playing, teaching, they all complement each other. It's more or less the same thing in a different atmosphere. Question from Matthew Williams. Tips on preparing for college and college auditions. What do you listen for when listening to an audition? Oh, that's a great question. The audition process is such a hard process for any student, high school age, going into grad school. And I do find it's a learning process on the other end when you listen to a number of auditions and you become aware of what things that you are taken to, and then when you discuss with your colleagues, it's very personal. So you could have a great audition and you could get two different views of that person's playing. And that's what music is, and so it kind of makes you learn that, not everybody's going to love exactly what I do or not. But I think there are some standards that you have to have going into an audition. You have to hit the basic elements of music, which is intonation and rhythm, tempo, and then of course phrasing and sound are huge, and then that special something, which is sort of like the instinctual. I think there's two kinds of, you have to fuse, my father used to always say this, you got to fuse the intellectual part and the instinctual. And really, that's when you can do something great. You're thoughtful, but yet you're playing from the heart. It's coming in from inside of you. But without good, solid rhythm, if your rhythm is all over the place and you're not being accurate, if your pitch is not, again, if it's not centered, if it's out of tune, those are things that we notice, when you're sitting there listening. And but again, you have to sort of meld all of these things together. I think it's good to think about when your practice session, you're preparing for an audition. Well, if I were to judge my intonation, where am I? If I'm to judge my rhythm, where am I? If I'm going to judge my sound, and I'm very affected by sound. So when somebody comes in with a beautiful sound, and that's why I'm talking about vibrato, when I hear that beautiful sound, maybe I let other things slide in my opinions. I am taken by a vibrato, I'm taken by color in the sound, and so that is something, and everybody's different. Some people are less taken by sound, and if it's less rhythmic and steady in terms of tempo and accuracy, that really bothers them. Or some people, want things to be a little bit more refined and sort of this way, and some people like more personal, expressive playing, and they have different ideas of what where that should be. So it's a very personal thing. But most importantly, you have to be convinced of what you're doing. Play how you want to play, and how you feel is convincing that you're playing from yourself, and that you're involved in what you're doing. But you also have to cover those other boxes, I think, which are important. I mean, like when I get on stage in the quartet, it has to have a level of intonation and ensemble. We don't want anybody to notice that. It's a lot of work just so they don't, notice that it's out of tune. They can think about the music and what's important. But we have to work hard at all that stuff, and it's tough. And it's an interesting to be on the other side of an audition and see how people prepare. I think nerves are a big thing. I see some people paralyzed with nerves in audition, and we have a lot of sympathy. Whenever anybody comes into the hall for their audition, I think everybody's on their side. They want to hear a good audition. And so try to not feel like you're being judged, I think is really important. And I think practicing for the audition, which means practice performing. If you are sitting there practicing only slowly, this note to this note to this note, when you get up for that audition, everything is going to be new because you haven't practiced it for the audience in a larger, bigger picture. And that can be paralyzing. So I think every part of your rehearsal, you're practicing, there should be a performance element to it. Or you practice slowly, but you're performing. And that you'll feel much more comfortable. And play that audition 100 times before you get up there. For one person, for two people, for the cat, whatever. You play it every day, 2 or 3 times through. And by the time you get to that audition, you know what's going to happen. You have a certain level of confidence. Even if you're nervous, it's going to go a certain way. So you want your level to be either here or here, right? Whereas opposed to you could play it this way, but you're so nervous and you haven't had that performing experience, it could be down here. So trying to keep it that way. I mean, I don't always play my best. I know it. Most of the time it's a little less than I would like it to be, but I hope that it's not going to drop way down because of my nerves and that I can control it to a degree. Even if I'm terrified on stage, which can happen, and it's my own fault probably, but I still have a certain level of preparation from performing it. And that I think that can be very helpful. It's tough. Any audition is hard. And, but then again, I think we put too much pressure on ourselves. And if you try to make it not as important, that's another thing I've been thinking about. I'm reading this book about optimal performance, about being in the moment so that you're not overthinking. Those great performances when you're on stage and you don't really care so much, but you're really enjoying it and you're living in the moment and your brain is not getting in the way. It's not saying, did you hear what happened? Wish that didn't happen. Or, oh, we got, what's coming up and that's, let's see how we do. Those kind of thoughts make it hard to live in the moment. And the magic of performance is when those thoughts are not there. And so I think there's ways of breathing exercises, things that can get you to be able to relax. I know I'm off topic, started going into performance anxieties, but something that from this book I've been thinking a lot about. It's very helpful to me, at least. Oh, okay, very nice. Question from Lee Gaskins. Would you please share a bit on Menachem Pressler's personality and what it was like to work with him? So Menachem Pressler, the great pianist of the Beaux-Arts Trio for many, many years. He's now in his late 90s and one of the most inspiring musicians I've ever met. He's a huge mentor to me in the quartet, and he's shaped us in so many ways. And we've played many, many concerts with him, all 5 of the major piano quintets and piano quartets as well. And well, first of all, his personality, he lives and breathes music every day, all day, his whole life. And I remember the first time we met him, we were very young, and he traveled to Chicago and flew in that day, came to our rehearsal, and he's playing hundreds of concerts a year, and we're playing the Schumann Quintet, and we had a 4-hour rehearsal on the first movement, and with full energy. And he was teaching us the piece, and it was incredibly inspiring. But he was working on every phrase and how he thinks about music, how important and pure his phrasing and shaping is, and how his piano playing is so sensitive, how aware he is. I mean, I remember I've always felt like I had a laser beam in my head from his eyes, because as soon as I made that turn, there he was, looking at me, trying to express something, trying to get me to communicate with him. How we always talked about passing a line and taking a line. How you have to be open, like in a conversation. You speak, somebody responds, or somebody's talking to you and you're sort of nodding in agreement, and then as they're finishing, you're taking what they said. And that's the same in music, and I think he pulled that out of us as much as we could, and I always think about that when I'm teaching or performing, how deeply he cares about and how important music is to him, and his dedication to it at his age. It's remarkable. I mean, he's superhuman. We played a couple of years ago the Franck Piano Quintet for his first time, 93 years old, in Spain, another country. We went there and we rehearsed, and he's just, I think his constant exploring music and his energy and his devotion is sensational. And so I think I would say that about his personality taught me a lot about commitment, as well as the music that we learned from him. But I really appreciate that question, because I really do love talking about him and how important he is to everybody. So many musicians, quartet players, pianists, everybody. Thanks. Here's a question about Bach suites. Dear Mr. Amos, how do you play Bach Cello Suite No. 1 Prelude with the usual popular bowings, 3 slurs and separate bows, without bump on the 4th note because of the bowing? Yeah, I've been playing off of the Anna Magdalena manuscript, and I do the 3 da 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 da. I don't want to demonstrate it right now. I feel like I always have to practice this to get my bow doing what I want it to do. But to try, I think a lot of it has to do with flexible hand and firmness. And this summer I was playing the Prelude every day, and I did a little performance. And to me, it's if I feel good about it, I feel good about a lot of things on the instrument. So I like I haven't done it in months now, but a lot of it has to do. You talk about not bumping on the 4th note. I think it's a matter of how much bow you use and being flexible here. If you're rigid anywhere, I think that's one way of smoothing that out. But flexibility is the key for me in this prelude. Not to be overly soft. I feel like you have to have good balance on the fingers, and the fingers have to work. I've been doing a lot of, with my students in scales class, a lot of step check and developing flexibility in the hand and the fingers, strong pinky push-ups, things like that. Working smooth changes, flexibility at the frog. Steve Doane talks about the seaweed motion, developing that ease. But I practiced the Bach this summer. I did a lot of slow work on the Prelude to make the sound, to find the sound that was clear and clean. I've always found that difficult. has to do with the balance of the arm and the fingers for me, and I can kind of find it now, and then but I feel like I have to, if I don't practice it for a couple of days, I lose it. So I like to use the prelude as not a technical exercise because it's such beautiful music, but also sort of creates a balance for me in string crossings, which I use it as a tool to help me find that clarity and musical expressiveness as well. But thank you for that. Question from Tochi Kasui. I'm sorry about these names. I'm just butchering everybody's name. Sorry for a very basic question from a beginner. I have been worrying about my bowing over years, which has big gaps between up and down. Any tips to shorten them, or do I need just one more experience? My bowing over years, which has up and down. I'm trying to understand the question so I can help. Either you're asking about smooth bow changes. I mean, if I were to talk about the bow, I think you can think about it in the different parts of the bow and what you're doing, and the motion that you want to create, and what parts of the arm are doing what when. So you know that different parts of the bow have different motions. At the frog, maybe it's very loose hand, and it's a little bit of a motion from the upper arm that swings. Yeah. As you go further out, you're going to start to open up. There's a lot of this, if you read Steve Doan's book, Ergonomics, he talks about this. He has a chart. It's a fantastic chart. Talks about the different parts of the bow, and how you use different parts of your arm and hand. So further out in the bow, maybe the middle part, you're starting to open up a little bit more with your forearm, and your fingers are a little more firm, and the upper arm is a slight swing. And then as you get further out to the tip, now you're using a lot firmer hand, and you're opening more here, and there's a sort of motive power in the shoulder. You're not raising it, but you're using that motive power here. That sort of gives you a little bit more firm weight in the upper part of the bow. I also think a lot about the back, so that what makes a down bow and an up bow, and where does that come from, and about the motion. I feel like, you know, I've asked students before, what moves the bow? And they might say, oh, the hand, right? Or, oh no, it's the arm. And the real answer is that the initiation of the bow comes from the torso or the hips, or even from as low down as the legs, so that you feel that initiation through your entire body, from the legs to the hips, which initiate that. So in order to find a very good working bow stroke, you have to make sure that you're using your big muscles. And if you're only using small muscles, you're going to develop a lot of tension and pressing and lack flexibility. But if you're able to use, another good exercise is just to do this. Just try to do it with your arm once. You feel no motion in the shoulder blades. But if you put your hand here and you can feel that motion, so if you use that motive power, you can feel the back and the shoulder blades working. If you do it without that, this is what you get. You tighten here. So if you're having problems with your bow stroke, you say down bow and up bow, think about what your arm is doing, what your back is doing, and be aware of that. And if you're not using in a way, your whole body, I think it's very difficult to pull a nice sound. And I think there should be some freedom. I've been thinking about moving more. All my teachers I haven't had one teacher from Tanya Carey to Paul Katz to Parisot that didn't talk about movement I'm not saying you have to move like crazy. You know, sometimes you want to be a little still and focus on what's going on here. But even the slightest movement here is going to create what you need to do here. So practicing moving with the bow, maybe against it before the bow change, or you move against it. My teachers always talked about right to left leg, feeling the weight in the floor, and how how you're using your back muscles. Maybe as you're going out to the tip, you feel the upper spine expanding. As you're going down to the frog, you feel the lower spine. It grounds you. So just being aware physically, I think, can help with the basic bow stroke that you're working on. I hope that answers your question. I really do. Maybe we have time for one more question. I think this is a really good, well, there are two questions here. I'm feeling discouraged about my intonation. I know that my intonation is better on average than it was a year or two ago, but I am not improving as quickly as I want to. Do you have any suggestions? And the last question is, how has your perspective as a musician and artist changed throughout your career? So I'd like to answer those two. Intonation is so important and such a big part of what we do. And I've also been thinking a lot about intonation. I've read some books on it, and I've thought about, the different kinds of intonation. Most importantly, though, I think it's being aware of overtones, harmonics, and using your cello's natural resonance to find a note that you want, and then to base other notes around your main notes. And sometimes that's a decision, a personal decision, whether it's going to be higher or lower. In the quartet, we have a lot of just intonation, which is chordal intonation, where we have a tonic, and someone might have a third. And if it's a chordal passage, that third in just intonation has to be a little lower. Now, if I were playing a scale, it's going to be a little on the low side. So if it's a melodic passage, then I have to think about a more expressive intonation, or Pythagorean intonation, which is a higher third. So it really depends, but I think understanding the different kinds of intonation, just intonation, Pythagorean intonation, and of course equal temperament when you're playing with a piano, and that changes everything because you have an immovable instrument with a certain pitch that you have to adjust to. Understanding that is incredibly helpful. Playing in a quartet, we're doing a lot of just intonation, so we're constantly adjusting thirds, sevenths, and how to find a starting pitch, with all the open strings. If it's an F major, I can tune to my open C. Or if it's playing Dvorak American and there's a lot of open A's, I need to tune to the A string, which is going to make it higher, so that you have to make some decisions. What are you tuning to? That being said, I think using natural resonance, really listening for overtones, took me a long time to do. I think to really, really understand and listen for. But I think for me, a lot of intonation is not only oral, but it's sense too. And when something is really resonating, I can feel it in my instrument. I can feel it in my fingertip. So when I have one of these notes that has to be pure, that has a lot of sympathetic harmonics, open strings, I can feel a tickle, and that lets me know I'm in that sweet spot. Phil Setzer gave me the exercise years ago to really find that sweet spot. It's good to play a little flautando. And you can really find those overtones like crazy. It's a little harder when you focus, you deaden the overtones with solid note. So that's one way of doing it, but I can feel it in my fingers, and I can feel it in the back of the instrument. And when I started listening for that and using my sensual feel a little bit, I think I made a lot of progress. So knowledge of the intonational systems, sense of feel, and Paul Katz, I remember him saying, you always have to have that ear for intonation. You can't let it go. So when you're playing, of course you have to be in the moment, but you have to be just always sort of aware of where that pitch is. And that takes concentration. When you go to a note and you play a few notes and you come back to it, is it the same note? If it's not, it's noticeable. But if you're a little too tight, or your head's down here, or you're not paying attention to what's coming out, that's when I think intonation suffers. So a lot of it has to do with awareness. So I hope that helps in your quests. I'm still on the quest too. So we're all trying to develop our intonation. I want mine to get better. I'll just keep working, I guess. And then the last question was, how has your perspective as a musician and artist changed throughout your career? Yeah, I mean, I think teaching has helped me think about things a lot. I think I went through periods where I was sort of, I needed to be fed a little bit. I think I always had good musical instincts, but I also think that I lacked enough of that thoughtfulness. And so I feel like over my career, I'm sort of looking for that, and trying to think a little bit more, yet not lose the instinctual side of things. But having performed a lot of the repertoire, the main repertoire of Haydn and Beethoven quartets and Shostakovich quartets and Bartók and Carter, I think I realized that all music is expressive, and that's the goal, is communication, and that's the ultimate goal, is that you really say something. Of course, you have to be faithful to the score and the intentions of a composer. I know from working with new composers that they have the same goal. It's interesting, you suggest something and they're like, well, this is not sad enough, or there's not enough earnest quality to the way you're playing that. And I think that's the same for anything. I think Beethoven would have felt the same way about anybody performing his music. And you have to communicate. And if you think that way in your rehearsals or in your approach, of course, I'm talking about intonation, all this other stuff, they just have to be there. That's a part of a good performance. But being focused on the end goal, which is that communication, finding something special in a performance, it's always searching for that, like Menachem Pressler would do. You never give up. You're never going to be perfect. You're never going to be like, wow, I've done it now. That's never going to happen. But it's having that as your goal is a much better way of thinking about things, and it's much more satisfying. And when I think that way, I look forward to rehearsal. That's the other thing. I think it's important to try to enjoy the rehearsal process as much as possible. That's what we spend in the practice process, and make that fun. And if you make that interesting and fun, then they're going to hear it. If you go into rehearsal with energy and sort of like curiosity, the quartet will play better, or you'll play better in your practice session. And so I think I've changed a lot in that. I think I used to be really hard on myself as a player. And maybe I needed to be, maybe you need to go through that, I don't know. But I think also sort of thinking big picture. I think I'm a better musician. I don't know. I mean, in 5 years, I might look back in myself now and not be satisfied. That's the other thing, is I look back and I think about things that I was thinking about, or things as a teacher that I was focused on, and not exactly satisfied with that, which is okay. I think it's good that hopefully making progress, like my mother, who's still practicing her vibrato, and changing her vibrato, which is, great. Yeah. So closing remarks. Yeah, I'm always enjoy these cello chats, and if you have any other questions, feel free to email me. And I hope I start to see more people out there in person at concerts. You know, of course we have to be safe, but hopefully things are going to look better. And I'm optimistic and hoping that we're going to have more of that in the future. So anyway, thanks a lot. I enjoyed it. And again, feel free to contact me if you have other thoughts or you want to tell me something I forgot to say. I would love to hear that. Thanks.